Greetings, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to the batch video for the web novel Thieves Dungeon from the website Royal Road. This video will contain chapters 9 to 12, and as always, I hope that you enjoy. Chapter 0.9 The Adventurers. Olin Fremd, High Mage of Colton, despised storms. He had aged centuries ago, soon enough that he kept his pretty face and his curled golden hair. But there was one thing that reminded him of his real age, and that was the way his bones ached when storms were on the way. His knees twinged and ached in the hours beforehand, when the smell of rain was in the air, but the deluge was yet to fall. When the clouds swirled overhead, darkly threatening, cracks of lightning visible in the swollen underbellies, he felt pain for once as he pampered existence. He liked to retire to the bath and sink into the water, underneath mountains of fluffy soap bubbles. The heat of the water made him feel like he could drift off to sleep. And then his eyes snapped open. Something was wrong. An immense surge of mana was just swept through the city. He shot up out of the bathtub. A maid refilled the hot water, flinched back. Her eyes spared the worst of the sights by a convenient clump of soap bubbles. Olin had no time for dignity. He seized the towel, threw it around his waist, and went running down the halls towards the vast double doors of his laboratory. It was too late. As he threw open the doors, every arcane instrument was askew, every dowsing stone burned out, every orrery spinning. His creation, his beautiful creation, sat in the center of the room, an ominous presence. It was housed in what looked like a bronze diving bell, with a single porthole and the smoked green glass. As he peered through, what met his eyes was enough to make Olin stagger back and retch. It had all gone terribly wrong. The mana had fed uncontrolled growth, and that meant mutation, corruption. He felt the burn of bile in his throat. The maid was following him, looking concerned. "Bury it," Olin said. His pretty face was dark with anger. "What?" Hers was high, cracked with fear and confusion. "Find a shovel, take it into the garden, and bury it." Olin snapped, glaring at her with such an intensity that she flinched back, and he had landed a physical blow. He had no time. He would go to the Adventurers Guild and, Olin paused, reconsidering. He would put on clothes, and then go to the Adventurers Guild, and have those useless clods search for him. A wave of mana like that could only mean one of very few things, and the most likely was a newborn dungeon. In the confusion and terror of the flood I had leveled, the annihilation of my gardens had granted me enough soul fragments to break through. My field of ethereal mana slowly swept outwards, filling the ruined domain and going beyond the previous bounds. In one direction my new territory was more sewer tunnels, but in another it expanded through the hole that I had torn in the walls. My domain was over a deep, muddy lake, but only briefly. What I discovered was that the open air, without walls, my mana would simply continue to spread outwards, until it was too thin for me to see through it or control it. In order to claim territory, I needed it to be enclosed, and I had a plan for that. First, I had to rebuild. My fungal gardens needed to be replenished, my populations restored from the bottles that I had sprouting off from the shaft of my sanctum. Thankfully, I had mana to spare after the deluge. I only needed time. I didn't know that I had time any more. After restoring the gardens as best I could, my mana was low again. I had just enough to throw up a barrier of succulent blooms to guard the newly opened breach around the great tree that I had grown. The tree itself was something of an anomaly. It had been planted as an apple seed, but after the sheer amount of mana I had fed it, the bark had turned dark and the branches were twisted. The leaves waned and threads of purple. It moved faintly, even without the wind, and as I watched, a toad hopping near the base of the tree was seized by a sudden twist of the roots, letting out a frantic rivets as the wooden tendrils slowly crushed down. I flinched out of the poor creature's demise. It was safe to say that I made something rather sinister. After considering, I did something I had been delaying for a long time. My gardens were to the north of my sanctum, which was a tall chamber within the walls of a sewer. Very likely there was another tunnel passing by my sanctum to the south. Before, I had chosen not to dig that way, for fear of exposing myself from another direction. Now, with the breach letting sunlight stream into my domain, it seemed too late to worry about that. Instead, I wanted to expand quickly and raise my mana income as high as I could. Rather than digging directly from my sanctum, I chose to spot a little east of it, starting to eat connecting tunnels into the gardens to the south. Within an hour, I had broken through, and my reward was immediate waft of the sewer fresh air. Using the last of my mana, I created several vipers and unleashed them. There was a heavy stock of rats in the new tunnel, maybe hundreds of them. So I sealed the exits and poured my green-scaled beauties in, intending to reap enough mana to start working on some proper defenses. There was so much to do, and so little time on my side. Ephria hated sewers. She had made her start as a dungeoneer, carving her way through the hordes of creatures that infested them. The crawling bugs, the enormous rats, the unspeakable foul slimes that oozed their way through the man-made tunnels. A heaven for monsters. It was as if people were trying to attract monsters' infestations. She frowned at Olin. It was a hard thing to do, considering he was awfully pretty and awfully close to naked, with only a towel wrapping around his slender hips, but she managed nonetheless. The Cupid's bow of her lips pursed in disdain. "You want me to investigate the sewer? Darling, I'm the leader of the Adventurers Guild, not a novice. You want some farm boy with a rusted sword who's just signed up. I am too good for this." She feigned interest in her nails as she leaned across her desk, water dripping down his half-naked body. "It has to be you," Odin insisted. "There's a new dungeon down there. I can smell it, right beneath our city." "You? No, I can tell you what it is. You gifted your little lapdog gent a bound dungeon core, and it got loose when he died. No? And now you want me to go personally reclaim it." She huffed. "You could at least be honest about thinking that I'm your errand girl." Fine. It got away from me, I'll admit it. Odin threw up his hands, exasperated. He got so easily upset when the world didn't give him what he wanted. "I'll get it." The intrusion of Morgul's voice made both of them remember he existed. Two very annoyed, very pretty faces turned to glare at their unwanted third wheel. A weather-beaten old dwarf with a grey beard who sat quietly in the corner, casually polishing a golden ring. He had dozens of them. They shone on his scarred and muscular fingers. Afraid didn't like Morgul one bit. It was a shame that he held his post in second-in-command since before she was born. "I'll go handle what business needs doing," rolling his eyes at them both. The dwarf slipped from his chair and set the ring back on his middle finger. "You two can go back to your flirting." As the door slammed shut behind him, cutting off their protests that they were definitely not flirting, Morgul shook his head. The young had so much energy, and they spent it all on pointless things. Now, he'd need a warrior who could count past 3, a priest without a stick up their rear, and a thief that could trust not to spend the whole trip eyeing his jewelry collection. I floated in between the space where I chose attunements, studying the different futures presented to me. Refinement, a word I already embodied, thank you, was a tantalizing opportunity. The treasures I produced would rise to the next level, and so would my shard crafting. I could outfit my minions with beautiful weaponry. Subtlety as an aspect to aspire to. The immediate benefit was to craft a fake core, luring adventurers down the wrong path. It was an added layer of defense that would protect me. But Gleam and Gloom called to me. They were a layer with defenses I already had, crafting a labyrinth of illusions to ensnare my enemies. Confused, invading adventurers would be more susceptible to my camouflage minions, more likely to stumble into my defenses. The synergy between the two were too good to pass up. You have selected Gloom 1. The shadows in your dungeon deepen, swallowing all light. Enemies will see phantom foes within the darkness. When I came to, Isis was trying to get my attention. His face loomed over the jeweled surface, boggling eyes staring at me. Boss, we got a problem." I turned immediately to see what he meant. An enormous, slithering fish had arrived in the area that I'd sealed off to set my vipers loose in. It had wriggled its slimy grey body through some crack or crevice, and was now feasting relentlessly on the population. A mouth like a shapeless round tunnel full of sharp yellow teeth sloped up all in its path. 6 beady eyes stared out into the world, emotionless, seeing only things that to be eaten. 2 tendrils extended parallel to its long serpentine body, whipping through the air to snatch up prey. It was some sort of mutant lamprey, oozing grey slime from its skin. Of every creature that I had seen in this wretched sewer, it was by far the ugliest and least deserving of life. Orem lifted his head, waiting for the command. I gave it a flash of bloodlust. Go. Kill. End of chapter. Chapter 0.10. Blood in the Water. 7, 8th. Old Kaz grinned widely, showing the mouth full of crooked tusks and an immense tombstone teeth. The ogre had to stop at 8th because of how many fingers he had left on his scarred hands. And what comes after 8, Morgul said. The ogre paused, the brow furrowed, and his intense mental constipation. 11? Morgul sighed. He had asked for a fighter who could count to 3, and 8 was more than 3. In fact, 8 was double 3. I suppose that 11 does come after 8. You've got the qualifications for the task, my friend, and you're welcome on my team. He offered his hand, which was quickly enclosed in the grip of an enormous meaty paw. They shook comrades in arms. The lamprey was making short work of the food chain. It moved with writhing sudden jolts, using its long tongue as it lashed at straw-dragging vermin from the cracks of the walls where they tried to hide. Its tendrils out, landing whip-crack blows that stunned its prey. Within the cramped environment of tunnels, it was an apex predator. I suppose I should have admired it. I couldn't bring myself to find anything admirable about such an ugly, slug-like thing. As I watched it encounter 2 of my vipers in the swampy waters, the fight was brief, brutal. A lashing tendril struck the viper that approached it from the front, knocking it down while the one that came up from the side lunged at the lamprey's flanks. The viper's teeth struck home, but slid off the lamprey's slippery body, falling to pierce through with a sudden lurch. The vile slug rolled sideways, dislodging the viper. It curled itself and slithered into a knot and lunged before the snake could recover. I mentally winced as I watched the green scales finish down the horror of the mouth. A second viper, alone, could do nothing. It turned to flee inside the water of the squirming horror chased it down. I couldn't watch. Arum was on his way, moving silently down the passage between the 2 sides of my domain. I decided to tilt the scales. Silently, I began to hollow the space under the lamprey, leaving a thin barrier of stone while eating the pitfall beneath. And then it was time. Arum had cut through the waters as he swam forward. I frightened a family of rats from their burrow, sending them darting through the lamprey's sight. The greedy creature went after the bait and lunged, a frantic spasm of motion that twisted and kicked through the long body. Arum was precise and deadly. He lunged in that moment that it caught the rat in its jaws and were briefly occupied, coiling its body and leaping, jaws outstretched. His fang sunk into the beast's eye. It let out hideous, wet sound of anger, the rat's bloody hindquarters dropping from its jaw. The tendrils whipped out and smashed into Arum's skull as he released his grip on the mangled eye socket. The blow smashed him back into the water, briefly stunned. I had no voice to scream and no hands to call as the lamprey dived after him. And he nearly curdled away from the seeking jaws, only feigning injury. His teeth sunk into the side again, and the root of one tendril, yellowish blood billowing into the swirling mud of the waters as bubbles roiled to the surface, as the beast thrashed and rose and tried to throw him off. I could hardly follow the entanglement of bodies as the lamprey rolled over and over. Arum let out a suddenly and slipping away. He coiled up and spat a stream of venom from his throat as the beast tried to chase him. Unable to catch up with the clumsy, lurching motions, Arum was as fast as an arrow and as agile as a fish. The poison landed against the beast's remaining eye on its wounded side, sizzling into caustic bubbles as it burned the creature as it let out a whining scream. Arum kept the blind flank now, the creatures circling one another, the lamprey trying to hold into sights. I wanted to believe it was over, but it would only take one good stunning hit. and the larger beast would win with a heartbeat that took Harum to recover. He landed again, grabbing the tendril off his jaws and rolling to throw his weight against the wound that he'd made earlier. With a wrench and a tear of his flesh, the whole limb was ripped away. The lamprey twisted its remaining tentacles, flashing through the air. Catching Harum beneath the jaw, he reeled back, the lamprey coming after him with a slurping mouth wide. A kick of his tail and Harum leapt back, evading the beast as a slimy bulk crashed down. And now the whole battle began to turn in our favor. Harum was in the blind spot now, harassing the beast's sides with lightning-fast bites, withdrawing and slipping away each time the lamprey tried to turn and chase him. He was smart enough to hold position on the beast's behind flank and wear it down with repeated small wounds. I could see the venom starting to work, slowing its reactions. Sensing its own death, the lamprey suddenly lashed out with its tail. In that moment, Harum darted back and turned and wreathed for safety of the nearby burrow. And it crossed directly over my trap. At my command, the ground dropped out from under the lamprey. It fell into a steep pit, and suddenly the mucous membrane that armored its body became a hindrance, making it slippery to climb, rebounding off the walls as it frantically tried to escape. I planted explosive blooms into the wall, watching them swell to bursting as the beast fought to climb out. One by one, the fungal blooms detonated and tore the lamprey into bloody, twitching shreds. Morgul was in a sour mood as he stomped through the low town. His first choice of thief was dead. 2 fingers had been hanged 2 months ago. Aye, that was the way with them. The good ones got cocky and got themselves killed. The bad ones just went right to the second part. The world was at a loss for old thieves. As he walked along, a young sprog shot past him, bumping against the old woman in front of him for a split second. Morgul stepped forward, checking the young man hard with his shoulder, while his hand shot out and seized the pickpocket's wrist. The thief sunk to the streets in agony, holding back a scream as the dwarf rough-handed twisted and the bones in the breaking point. The stolen coin purse dropped from his fingers. The dwarf caught it on the edge of his toe and kicked it up into his hand with a jingle of coins as he let the young fellow go. It was a rough lesson, one that would keep the sprog out of trouble for a few weeks while his hand healed. "I believe this is yours." He was surprised that the old woman looked distinctly ungrateful. She was tall, thin, old Biddy, with her hair back in a bun like a graying librarian. She took the purse without even a hint of a smile. So was the kid. I was training him. She took the purse with her left hand because her right one ended in a stump. The surest sign of a thief. "Oh!" Morgul's eyes went up. "Say, how good are you with your left hand?" "I don't do work like that, old man." "Aye, nothing like that. I happen to be putting an adventuring crew together and—" Harum had refused to eat the emerald core. I offered it to him, and he simply turned his head aside, slithering back to wrap around the egg and sleep off the battle. As he stumbled, a hazy aura surrounded him. Thin ribbons of white light formed in the air around him as he poured into his body until his scales grew too brightly to be seen, except for the brilliant silhouette. One of my creatures had finally absorbed enough mana to evolve. Your creation is undergoing an evolution. During this time, mana you gift them will be more effective, and they will be easier to shape. Choose a path. Gold-streaked constrictor, common. The giant snake crashes foes with an unusual strength and vast resilience, but lacks the poison of smaller species. Ophidian, common. Shedding the skin of a common beast, this demi-human takes on a civilized traits, but returns much of its beastly nature. Abandons the gold-streaked bloodline. Gold-streaked king cobra, rare. Ruler of serpents, the species feeds primarily on lesser snakes and gains increased toxicity as it does so. Lesser hydra, rare. Relative to dragon, this lesser hydra can grow into incredible sizes as it consumes all with its 7 heads. Consumes the gold-streaked bloodline. Lamprey certain mutant. Absorbs the traits of the last foe defeated. Gains defensive mucus and tendrils. I would start with the obvious. I was not choosing Lamprey Serpent, and I was not choosing Lesser Hydra. I would hope that the first was obvious. As for the second, I had a feeling that I would be able to choose more powerful options in exchange for the bloodline as Harum matured. Ophidian was out for much the same reason. In the end, the choice was rather straightforwardly King Cobra. The cannibalism was unseemly, but the ability to distill the venom was precious. As I made my selection, a thin barrier of orange light surrounded Arum. It was like he was stuck in amber, his darkened form within starting to shift, to blur at the edges and change form. And now it was my turn. I had chosen my attunement but not my bonus for leveling. Since I had yet to choose a schema slot, I chose last time. I demurred on taking a fourth. While the mana expansion continued to interest me, it wasn't something that I could regularly use until I began to devour larger prey. So, it was time to see how much I offended the luck of the gods. End of chapter. 0.11 Adamant. The great wheel spun, spitting off golden sparks. I watched as it rolled to a halt, resolving from a blur into a stone wheel carved with alcoved segments. When it finally stopped, a statue of a pig-headed god stood before me, holding a treasure chest with rich gold and jewels. The statue had actually animated and taken a few steps before the whole wheel lurched, and suddenly turned so that another segment faced me. This one was shabby, a faceless statue with a plain box. So it was safe to say that the gods were still mad at me. The statue set the box down at my feet. With a satisfying click, this lid swung open. Within was a small, furry creature with long claws and a face like a white mask. A sloth. The gods had given me a sloth for a prize. I was thinking some very interesting blasphemies as the void in the wheel faded out. Morgul sat uncomfortably in a little temple, an owl perched on his head. There were owls everywhere, small, large, spotty, white-faced. Every kind of owl was hopping amongst the pews, most of them sneaking tidbits of food from the crowd. The one sitting atop Morgul's mane of graying hair was thankfully a small one, a little round ball of snowy fluff. Morgul! He was tackled suddenly from behind, dainty arms the color of coffee wrapped around his shoulders. Sky blue tattoos and a mysterious picture script wound around her wrists to her elbows. "Hi, girl, it's been too long." Reaching up, the dwarf patted his favorite priestess on the head. She was barely taller than him, with the dark hair cut into a bowl around her hidden face. Even he'd never seen her without an owl mask that she wore. "So," she asked, "what is it this time? You never stop by unless it's business." "I guess I don't. This time it's a dungeon. Right beneath the city, I'm hearing, and it was bound at one point, so it might be the sort that holds a grudge." To his surprise, Strix only nodded. "My owls told me something like that. I'll be ready to go in the morning." "How do they know so much, Strix? I've never understood." Morgul raised a finger to pet the little owl on his head. Smoothing over the soft feathers around its neck, it pecked at him. "Oh, Morgul, it's not about what you know, it's about who you know." The sloth happily played with its toes as I got down to serious business. Arum had refused to eat the emerald shard, and I wasn't going to give it to this ridiculous creature, which left me with a few choices. I would have to make a new creation to carry the shard. At first I was envisioning an altered viper, possibly two-headed, or with a scorpion sting. Then an even better idea came to me. I shaped a man out of earth and mud, a crude golem with club feet and enormous four-fingered mittens for hands, a shapeless blob of dirt for the faceless head. Isis was my hands. He pressed the gem into the center of the dirtman's skull like a cyclopean green eye, and he scurried back. Nothing happened. I poured energy into him now, pushing 4 threads of the purest mana into the earthen statue, one through each limb. They connected together to the gem, a circulatory system of crude energies. With a jolt and a shudder, the dirtman came to life and took a step forward. He left half his foot in the ground. I winced and pushed more mana into him, into the stuff of his body. I altered him to be more elastic, better glued together, altering his flesh to something between clay and stone that was pliable enough to make some clumsy shuffling motions, but still tough enough to not crumble apart with each step. When that proved to still leave him somewhat crumbly, I hit upon a stroke of genius. I planted fungus on his back, shelves of broad mushrooms of the colour of teak, and I drew their roots through the whole of his body, anchoring his muddy flesh together to keep him from falling apart. In the end, I had made a very simple golem, a man-shaped clod of earth covered in colourful displays of spore and fungi. I named him Adamant, and as I did, a wave of exhaustion hit me. Minor fungal golem, flawed core of jewels, born of mud and tangled roots, this golem is slightly sturdier than the colonies of fungus that live in symbiosis. Having been given a shard, it boasts a small understanding of the world around it, with the potential to grow and learn. Attempt to create a name has failed. You lack the arcana to maintain more than 2 names. Adamant, damn it, Adamant, Adamant, Adamant. I would name him, even if the gods wouldn't acknowledge it, and I spitefully chanted the name, and a brief spell of dizzy wore off. I had the option of taking a new golem type as a schema. I considered it, but in the end I dismissed the idea. Without the ability to control them directly, they simply wouldn't be very useful. The mind I felt within the link of Adamant was murky and muddy. He had the kind of thoughts you would imagine a particularly intelligent stone having, and mostly remarked on how pretty the gardens were. So, at least he had taste. I had a few other options. The centipedes that guarded my sanctum had spent days being steadily empowered by its blessing, becoming more and more poisonous. I could make them larger and more deadly yet, or I could take a shot at making a more intelligent rat for Argent to lead into battle. But no, I had a perfect idea for how to use the schema slot. The sloth glanced up lazily from picking moss from its fur. Perhaps sensing my plans, I could have chuckled. End of chapter. Chapter 0.12. The size of a small horse, it had claws that could cut through steel, and the strength of a bear, and no inclination to use either. Those I had added out of some duty to give the creature the ability to defend itself before sending it out into the wide and dangerous world. No, the true purpose of the sloth was its fur. Before the creature, untamed and matted hair, the only home to a few species of moss that had latched onto the sedentary beast. Now it had become a miniature garden. I had planted a whole of my creations there. Bloody caps, nematocylia, fans of luminescent mushroom ears, clusters of long-stalked fungi, and fuzzy dandelion heads ready to scatter spores to the wind. It looked like a kind of coral reef had sprouted up on the creature's back. A tangled abstract shapes and bright pastel colors. It would carry my creations with it as it left my domain, spreading them across the fertile manure of the sewers. In exchange, it would be protected by the symbiosis with the garden. Succulent blooms and the other poisonous species lined its back, but I had ensured that the beast was quite immune to all of them. Anything attempting to prey on the clumsy, harmless sloth would quickly find itself reeling under dozens of poisons, every breath choked with toxic spores that drifted into the gardens of its back. That was how I had chosen the name. Sporeback Sloth. Slow enough for moss and lichen to grow on its back, this leisurely creature has become a living garden, protecting itself not only with a claw and muscle, but with armor and poison flora. My goal was simple. Right now, anyone entering my domain would see the garden of strange and luminous mushrooms, bizarre creatures as clearly a dungeon as anything could be. My best hope of protection was to confuse the enemy by spreading my influence across the sewers. If the entire underground labyrinth was chocked with mushrooms, my little territory would fade into the background. I gave the sporeback a prod, sending it slowly lopping down out of my domain. Once I had the mana, I would create more, sending them out as messengers to populate the sewers with my own brand of beauty. In the meantime, I had work to do. Argent and Isis had become friends somehow. Despite my mental probes the brave little Argent to stay away from backstabbing homunculus, they were playing tag with Adamant, thoroughly flummoxing the clod by weaving under his legs and over his head. The clumsy giant clapping his great hands down to catch them, and then peeping through his fingers to see nothing but empty air. I watched them for a while, It was nice to see my creatures playing in the carefree way that they could exist within my domain. For me, there had always been this kind of constant hum of anxiety in the air, a sense that something was coming for me. And I knew that fear was justified and right. That was the way that a dungeon had to live, constantly digging deeper. I was only soothed by the paranoias, by the satisfaction when I invented some new clever twist or turn to armor myself against the world outside. They paused eventually, first Ardent, then Adamant, sensing my attention on them. Isis making several more dive bombs around Adamant's head before he noticed the other two were no longer playing. He landed on the golem's shoulder and waited. I had a mission for them. My walls were still breached and strange black trees stretching out from the branches through the gap. Rather than close it off, I wanted to expand, but with no ceiling or walls, my mana was simply pouring out and dispersing into open air. I needed to enclose that flank, and walls of stone were both inadequate to do the task and unobvious signs to the humans. I therefore came up with a new plan. On the far side of the lake, a grove of bent, tangled-root trees grew up from the water, apparently well adapted to the swampy environment. As night set, Adamant slid down beneath and sank into the waters like a stone, wading slowly across. Perched at the top was Argent, her nose pointing into the wind like a masthead of some strange ship. Isis was the lookout, flitting high into the sky to watch the walls and to make sure that no humans oversaw the midnight mission. Meanwhile, I was playing with the newly opened space in the tunnel where we'd fought the lamprey. I decided to make it a swamp, churning the stone down to a fine mud and digging dozens of shallow craters that I filled via connections to my flooded underground tunnels. The thickets of the thin-stemmed glow-cap mushrooms promised easy food for vermin, but they became food themselves in time. Next was the time to make proper den for my snakes. Raising pillars of stone towards the ceiling, I riddled them with small burrows, placing the finest accommodations near the top of each column in the hopes of spurning my vipers to competition. Unable to resist the artistic flair, I began to carve images of coding snakes into the pillars, choosing to go for a rough and tribalistic style that blended with the craggy stone. I had almost taken my eyes off Adamant when trouble began. He was wading through the lake, his feet sinking into the mud with each step, the waters higher than his shoulders. Suddenly, a flicker of orange gold cut through the dark lake and slammed into his chest, sending him reeling back. Another darted at him from behind, slamming its body against his leg, nearly making him stumble. Adamant was struggling to keep his footing. Argent could only cling to his head, barely staying above water. End of chapter. And that concludes this batch video. I hope that you enjoyed. If you wish to support the channel, there are numerous ways to do so down below. Until next time, I hope that you all have a good one. And I'll see you all in the next video. Cheers.